I listened to that clip on the hybrids. Found it very interesting. It's a very interesting subject. I'm not sure. I've not listened to that show before, but the call in was, he did seem highly credible. There was just a very high level of believability about what he said. This seemed to me somebody to be honestly reporting with as much faith as they could muster an account of something that actually happened to them.
Well, I'm glad you had the time to listen to that one. I thought it was fairly notable. The show is a podcast that's been on for a few years, and people call in with a variety of ghost stories and paranormal experiences. And I agree with you, this one was awfully credible. I had spent some time in Long Island and got to understand the people to some extent. So the way the guy spoke, I was able to have some sense of his character just from knowing the type of people who live in that area. Yeah. But anyway, the story itself strikes me as being an excellent entree in this whole quote unquote phenomenon, if you want to call it a phenomenon. And well, I'm curious first more about what your reactions were and things that came to mind when you were listening to it.
Yeah. The first thing I suppose I'd say is about that story is that I was really surprised I've not heard more stories like that. In other words, highly credible accounts of interactions with hybrids. You see, the hybridization is something I would very much expect off the overall phenomenon of the interaction between human civilization and extraterrestrials of various stripes. I think it probably follows from efforts at open communication with government through the 40s and 50s, assuming that actually happened, and the failure for that to serve as a platform for any overall meaningful penetration into our culture would mean then that even ethically, it sort of allows them to begin to intervene genetically in our culture. There was like one thing that jumped out at me really as I listened to it, and it was, I'm sure you'll know why it came to me, but it was something Milton Friedman said, the great neoliberal economist. And he had once been visiting Sweden, and he took part, I think, in a number of worthy TV discussions and public debates. And of course, Sweden, I think at this time in the 60s and 70s, was the great paragon of the social democracy, the great instance of the middle way between unfettered capitalism and, the bloc. And in response to, there was a claim made by some Swedish social democratic economists. He boasted, he said, in Sweden, there's no poverty among Swedes. Milton Friedman fired back. He said, that's funny because in America, there's no poverty among Swedes either. And, it does point to, immediately you think it points to the cultural basis of, social, economic, and political arrangements, which in turn, and it's a very uncomfortable subject, it does point to sort of the genetic foundation of that culture, which is a roundabout way of saying is that you could look at the human race from a certain perspective and you'd almost say, you know what, it's nearly there genetically. This thing just needs a little tweaking. If you can imagine, the baseline IQ of the human race was just maybe another 5, 10, 15 points higher, people were just a little more open, our overall social trajectory would be significantly different, given the fact that, presently, we seem to have a series of problems which are, for large parts of humanity, insurmountable, but for other parts, not insurmountable. For instance, with population, sustainability, managing the social order, and so on. So, I suppose in a very roundabout way, what I'm getting at is that I would expect hybridization to happen. I have a good sense that it is happening, but I'm at a loss to explain why you hear so little of it, even at the level of, well, gee, I saw someone who looked really interesting, or, I saw something, or what have you. You just don't hear that much of it. And even of people I've known people who've had contact experiences, had abduction experiences. But you press the same people, they'd tell you flat out they've never seen anyone who had a stretch they would think was a hybrid. I could say that for myself too. So yeah, what came into your mind?
Well, naturally, the so-called hybrid idea came to mind, even though it's worth noting that nowhere in the call was this mentioned or suggested. We have a story from a guy who is attracted strangely to a girl at a bar, and the girl has some strange eyes, apparently, and he experiences a variety of telepathic communications, including a very strange event involving a train wreck. And I might include the clip with the conversation so that it can be heard. But the caller himself never suggests that it's a hybrid or a transgenic being, which means anything is possible. It's hard to imagine a person being physically different and communicating telepathically and having some access to the future, perhaps, who is just a run-of-the-mill, ordinary human being. So naturally, the hybrid idea comes to mind. Nevertheless, in listening to the story, well, there were two quotes from Strieber that we exchanged emails about, in which, on one hand, Strieber poo-poos the indigo children idea, which is kind of a new age meme or trope that was floated around. On the other hand, at the same time claiming basically to have personally encountered the same thing. If you're talking about children with exceptional abilities who are scattered here and there throughout the world, you're kind of talking about the so-called indigo children, whether you like it or not. Now, the descriptions offered by Strieber in the past about personally encountering some of these children might be just another attempt by Strieber to insert himself into the latest paranormal, supernatural phenomenon of the moment. On the other hand, you have a call to a call-in show like this one that seems to describe exactly that. We're not talking about a child in this case, but we're talking about someone who is slightly different, who blends in with people, and yet seems to have these mental abilities that we normally only associate with the visitors. So is it a hybrid, or is it a person who's emerging naturally out of the human population as a result of evolution, or are the two the same thing? In other words, maybe alteration of the human genome here and there is not the same thing as creating a hybrid or transgenic being. Well, it's hard to say, of course, what the case is.
Yeah, this issue of the the genetic relationship between, or the genetic basis of, say, psychic capacities and spiritual abilities, it's something no one has any idea about. For what it's worth, just on an anecdotal basis, from what I've heard from other people, and there does seem to be quite the basis for this. One woman I know who has extraordinary psychic capacity would tell you flat out it's in her family. And moreover, she can identify it in other people by simply asking, do any of their female relatives possess such abilities? It's just a giveaway. Equally, I don't know whether it cut out, but my friend who had quite a substantial contact experience, in that experience, one thing he learned from this being was that ultimately, from the absolute sense, their consciousness, if you like, is equivalent in being an instance of self-reflective awareness. However, there was obvious differences in the quality and nature of the manifestation. This being seemed to have extraordinary spiritual presence and psychic ability at once. What this being just simply related to my friend was this was the product of the body. And it said that if my friend had that body, immediately it would have that spiritual presence and immediately it would have those psychic capacities. So when we're, trying to understand this story, you need to be noted that the level of psychic ability being described is uncommon, even within the more, if you like, the more obtuse parts of the spiritual literature, where they discuss cities and manifestations that are found in the lives of significant saints and realizers. Like what she was doing was quite extraordinary, the level of it. So for that reason, I did associate it with extraterrestrials, or with this idea of hybridization. I did not associate it with something that's found within the human population at large. When you mentioned Strieber, something else came to mind was, of course, that strange boy or man who was looking after Strieber and the cabin in the woods. This was the being who would seem to hang around smoking cigarettes. He built himself a little watch near the cabin, and Strieber could never find him. However, Strieber did note his reaction when him and Anne went skinny dipping one evening in their pool. This being was irate at this idea and ran around creating vast noise and ructions. In the same way, in this story that this man relates, he notes that the girl says to him, he says, nothing can happen because of your impure thoughts. And I think the only thoughts he had admitted to about her was when he spoke to the barman, and the barman had said, well, she seems to be chatting up a lot of people. She's a bit of a floozy. So there just seems to be this, this was just a pattern. I thought there were similar patterns there in those stories.
Well, there is a significance to that moment, in my opinion, also. There is a kind of severity that you encounter again and again with these beings.
Yeah.
That if they're more spiritually evolved, or if we're given to understand they are, at any rate, there's a kind of always a sense that you have one chance.
Yeah.
Now, listening to that tale, you have the guy being told something which could potentially be inaccurate by the bartender, or could very well be accurate. You don't know. But in any case, the female involved reacts very harshly and negatively toward the guy hearing the information, simply on account of the fact that it occurs to him that it might be true, or that he is not pleased by her in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's an instance where you could well interpret the telepathic ability not to necessarily equal any greater access to truth. Because if, for example, the bartender's information is inaccurate about the girl, then at least according to the rest of us normal human beings, the guy receiving the information and having a negative thought as a result can hardly be to blame. If someone tells you false information and your mind entertains it for a moment and draws a negative conclusion, most ordinary people would not fault you, in some eternal sense, until the end of time. Well, you screwed up. You had an impure thought.
Yeah.
However, you can see the female being taking it personally if she had the expectation that this guy should know better. Maybe there was contrary information that he should have had access to, that he should have preferred or rated more highly. Although from his telling, the fact that she's hanging around in the seedy parts of the bar, like picking up guys near the restrooms, makes you wonder.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there again. So it's possible that in getting back to what you were saying about the physicality, the physical basis of these abilities, if you want to call them that, this mode of being in the world, the physicality does not necessarily equal deep philosophical knowledge or access to truth. If the girl were mistaken about the guy's reaction, or if she, unduly harshly faulted him for it, well, then she's not any more wise, in a sense, than anybody else. You have what's almost a standard female reaction on the part of someone who just happens to have access to, a sort of telepathic level of communication.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's very much of a piece with something that people who've involved themselves in practice, what is noticeable is that some of the best examples of advanced spiritual psychopathies are held with people whose belief systems are basically naive and bordering on the outright ignorant. It seems that these abilities can develop independently of any intellectual acuity, which is to say there are developments can occur in two different aspects of being where they are often confused. There's a sort of a sense, well, that, if such abilities exist, well, then clearly there's as you say, it's an ability to be truthful and to know truth. But again, this is, I suppose, you have to loop around and take into account that, what's now more common is this idea of lines of development. This is seems to be the new, or it's an idea by Gardner and Harvard, and it's an idea that's sort of getting a lot of purchase and thought about human development, that human beings have a whole series of lines of developments, and including spiritual, psychic, cognitive, moral, ethical, aesthetic, and the rest. And that, in this instance, when we're listening to this story, we may have what is an instance of someone who's highly developed capacities in one direction, undeveloped capacities in the other, which strangely, if you think about it, is what you would expect from an effort to manage the race. Sort of maybe if this is what's happened, capacities are gifted, but people are left free to develop them or not. So you could well expect that we have, people amongst us who have more potentiated, greater potential than what has gone before, but necessarily developed. Yeah, again, just to, I suppose, really recap just some of the ideas that I have about even this clip, is that one is that in the first instance, it seems that she had this extraordinary facility for telepathy. Then following from that, as far as I can tell, I don't know of any such reported instances within accounts of spiritual development where you find the city, where you find all these paranormal psychic abilities are developed in the course of the spiritual process. Even where telepathy tends to exist, it's not always, how would you put this always ready facility, which she seemed to have. She's out hanging around bars. Yeah, she can read people's minds with ease, it would seem. Then, assuming it is maybe an instant of hybridization, or she's a product of some sort of genetic management, you do then, you're sort of struck by this seemingly extraordinarily harsh behavior towards this man, who, it should be said, just by listening to him, he did sound to be quite very plausible, but it's sort of a likable guy. I didn't have any particular sense of him being especially egotistical or self-regarding. He's just somebody trying to tell a story with a great deal of just fidelity to what was probably what actually happened. And then, from that, we're sort of, we have to ask the question, well, why would you this seemingly unjust severity in dealing with people? And one way of answering that, assuming the above assumptions sort of hold, is that you have different lines of development, and all that may have happened is a certain line of development has been given a certain encouragement, whereas those, the other lines of development, such as cognitive development, moral or ethical development, remain untouched. And this would make sense if there is that sort of ethical predisposition towards maximizing human freedom and leaving us with the element of choice, which is to say we receive a genetic upgrade, but whether we make full use of it is up to ourselves.
Well, that certainly makes sense. I would put it in terms of, basically saying in effect the same thing, but I would put it in terms of the fact that when we contemplate these beings, whoever they are and whatever form they take, what we often forget, in fact, we almost always forget, is that if indeed they exist as life forms. These are forms of life. We tend to render them into cartoon images. They become two-dimensional. Even when we're thinking about supposedly spiritually advanced beings, we flatten the image, and we forget that as life forms, as forms of life, they have to be, of necessity, multi-sided. There's no form of life that's identical to itself, in other words. Human beings, you take a human being, you put them in one situation, they behave one way, you put them in another situation, they behave another way. And as life forms, they're going to be impossibly complex, and they cannot be simultaneously perfect in every regard, seen from every angle. And you could discuss that in terms of lines of development, if you like, and so on. That's one useful way of looking at it. Second thing that comes to mind, though, in accounting for her reaction as we understand it, is that it's very possible that among beings that have access to each other's minds in this way, there's a great amount of intimacy, and as a result, there's a very natural level of sensitivity. I think human beings have this level of sensitivity, but we gradually lose it over time. As we become battle hardened, we acquire this scar tissue, so that when we encounter another human being who thinks about us in some particular way, a negative way or an unjust way, we are mostly immune to it. We protect ourselves from any feeling of hurt and so on. Among these beings, perhaps it's not quite the same. And for those that live alongside us, they're kind of on two parallel tracks. On the one hand, they're living in this externalized, sort of evacuated human level in this human world. And on the other hand, of course, where they think they can indulge, they are on this parallel track, which is the presence of mind, of one mind to another. You get a similar reaction in those stories where someone is absolutely, mortified at the physical nature of a visitor that shows up in the bedroom, for example, in the middle of the night. And you hear that the visitor reacts almost with a sense of deep wounding, not just offended, but deeply hurt. If a abductee or a contactee says, "Oh, you're hideous," or "You're ugly," and the being recoils in shock, deeply hurt that they could be thought ugly, you encounter something of the same thing. You have beings that they're on this level of intimacy with each other all the time, and therefore perhaps they go the course of their entire lives without being, assaulted in this way where they're thought to be hideous or grotesque. And then when the human being has that thought and projects it and communicates it, they're deeply hurt by it.
Yeah, as you say that, it makes me think of the various accounts given of other civilizations. Greer talks about that there are civilizations who in their history, in their entire history, they've never had violence or warfare among themselves. And then you think too of some years ago, Balducci, the Vatican official, where he explained the Church's position on the Christian status or spiritual status of other forms of intelligent life. And he did note that for other civilizations, for other beings, they've not fallen from God's grace. As such, they do not need Christian redemption, meaning that there was no need for the church to evangelize these people in the event of contact. But it does bring up this idea of what that even means for a highly intelligent form of life not to have fallen, as it were. I suppose the most detailed account of what this could mean comes from the Billy Meyer case. True or not, he does have the story of going to the world of the Pleiaren, and he speaks about this. He speaks about their sensitivity in terms of having an open consciousness, where they are able to hear, if that's the right word, one another's thoughts. He said culturally that means there's a huge emphasis, or a very obvious emphasis, on the need to control your own thoughts for the sake of others, for simply not injuring them with your with your negativity. As such, they're very loath to allow people to come into the world. Moreover, if people are to come to the world and settle, what they do tend to do is replace the chemicals in the brain, according to Meyer. This is significant enough in and of itself, or to alter the personality and do for that negativity which so offends them. Equally, Meyer reports that how one of these Pleiaren had been made very sick as a result of fulfilling a mission here in the world, which had been to observe the course of the First Gulf War. Doing so, the sheer amount of violence and obviously injury and death associated with that had inflicted such psychological injuries on her that she required a particular treatment in the world. So this is, you do make that excellent point. It does raise excellent question. What is it like for them in contact with us? There's also something that comes to mind as we speak about this, is that in contact and abduction accounts, many of these beings are very slow to touch human beings. They refuse a handshake, or they resist a physical engagement. And I'd have to wonder, is that related somehow that the psychic energies, which are probably concentrated in proximity to the physical body, can make an easy leap into the psychological condition, or aura, or energetic body, call it what you will, of these beings. Can you think of sort of similar instances or examples which may point to their relation to having an open consciousness?
Well, probably in most contact stories and abduction anecdotes where telepathy and mind-to-mind contact is involved, you can glean some sort of aspects along the lines of what we're talking about. But it, in a more general way, calls to mind a thought that I've had in the past, which is that the secrecy, as we see it from our point of view about contact, may be as much to protect them as it is to protect us. If you consider, in a more human sense, the status of spiritual mastery on a human level, it's always seemed to me that the higher level of mastery a person attains, the more vulnerable they are, in a sense, the more easily they can be tipped over. If you can imagine almost a house of cards being built, the
Mm-hmm.
higher you build it, the less it takes to knock it all down.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we like to fantasize as human beings that mastery is a matter of increasing strength, it's always seemed to me that the more mastery, the more ultimate vulnerability. Now, if we consider these beings in connection with the concept of mastery, since they often demonstrate a kind of mastery, it seems to me that they may also be profoundly vulnerable, in as much as having contact with human beings threatens their mastery. If you go for this kind of, well, what is mastery? Mastery is a kind of exquisite control, whether it's self-control or control over interactions and so on. It's something that's also understood to involve intentionality. Human beings, typically, when they interact with each other, there's no mastery involved because it's just a sort of crude collision of personalities and wills and fragments of experience and so on. So we would say it's the opposite of mastery, or it's very far from mastery. When we talk about these beings, there's always this kind of exquisite sense of control that suggests mastery. So everything has to be just so. Everything has to be done just a particular way. Well, what would happen if they gave up on that insistence on control? Well, they would be giving up on their mastery. And if you give up on mastery, you allow all sorts of things to enter into yourself. If you sacrifice control over your surroundings and what comes inside of you, then you as a result are changed. So it's very possible that these visitors and their program of secrecy, it's really all just a function of their desire for control, because they really have to protect themselves. Having gone so far down the path toward self-mastery, spiritual mastery, and so on, not to handle us, with the greatest of delicacy and level of control would mean themselves getting dragged down in maybe all sorts of ways that we can't even imagine. And so maybe in that regard, secrecy is not so much about exploitation or depriving us of realization of their presence, but it's really about protecting themselves as much as perhaps protecting us.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. It sort of even makes sense from the little we can see, is that according to any number of sources, is that there has been good effort and successful effort to try and reverse engineer, or at least develop craft which mimic the abilities of some of the UFOs seen. Perhaps some groups on Earth are close to superhuman or interstellar travel. As such, they're close to making contact on their own terms. Yet, they are products of a culture which is clearly very unevenly developed. You have this technological development which in some critical regards may be equal to these extraterrestrial groups themselves, whereas alongside that you have the most errant and determined forms of tribalism is still present in the world. So they may have very good reason to be wary of us, and they may have reason to expect that this is the form of overall evolution that happens on a planet like ours. More than that, you have this issue with evolution itself. With evolution of any form of life, it's an obvious emergence into ever greater complexity. Though with that complexity there comes greater capacity and, as you say, greater mastery and control. But equally, with greater capacity, you have greater number of pathologies. More things can go wrong. There are more levels on which things can go badly wrong. I suppose a good macro instance of that is, say, this sort of social development you see in Western countries. You have, or the greatest most fertile intellectual cultures that have existed, outstanding technological development, at least relative to what's happened on the planet before. Yet social development, you can see there are acute problems to it, alienation and family breakup and the rest. That's happening on that gross micro level, but equally we could expect it to happen on the micro individual level for these beings, and even for their society as a whole, that they are quite susceptible to really the infection that we could pose to them. I suppose an instance of where we might see something like that happening is when you don't hear about much anymore, but through the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were any number of Eastern teachers or products of Eastern religious cultures who were deemed to be masters within the terms of that culture. They come west, and they go off the rails, start drinking and whoring around within the confines of their culture, and within the control that culture could exact on the consumption they would have of obviously materials and the social consumptions that would occur. They had exhibited mastery, yet those same people, once they came to the West, that mastery gave way as they obviously tried to adapt themselves to the environment present. In a bigger way, that might be the cost. That might be the cost for them of involving themselves with us. There's also another point I think it's useful to bear in mind here is a standard issue or standard account of these beings involves their extraordinary longevity. Their lives aren't 50, 60, 70 years, often they run into the centuries or thousands of years. As such, they may value their lives much more than we do. They may be far more or far less willing to even degrade its quality in what we would regard, what we think are even minor amounts. Which is to say, we might think, well, for them it's just an outreach mission to a more backward culture. Whereas for them it may be a matter of that this is doing some injury, at least some avoidable injury to something of vast value.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree. And getting back to a term that you used a bit ago, infection, to explore the idea further, you could say that, it's taken for granted in science fiction stories and even by science today that if you travel to an alien world, for example, that you might not only infect the world, but in turn be infected by it on the microbial level. So there's all sorts of concern about the Mars rover and probes sent to planets about whether, they're carrying bacteria or not, and so on. And likewise in science fiction, the stories, been told 1,000 different ways about human explorers going to a world and being infected by some native bacteria that humans can't resist, and all sorts of terrible things happen. Well, if we generalize from that somewhat, I think it's pretty useful in terms of this discussion. Traditionally, human beings, the human body is seen as separate from bacteria. So if there's an infection, the bacteria is understood to be a foreign agent, which has been combated for decades with antibiotics and so on. Yet increasingly at the same time, and it's perfectly logical, it's becoming more and more understood that bacteria and all sorts of small organic life, they're not really separate or foreign from the human body, but they're intrinsic to it. So you see a lot more in the news about so-called gut bacteria, and even correlations between digestive problems, lack of proper gut bacteria, and disorders like autism, for example. So these tiny organisms and almost civilizations of organisms are not separate from the human body, the human being, but rather part of it. In which case, what you would have to realize is that at the level of life, what is held inside of the boundaries of the human body is a lot more than the human person, what we traditionally associate with the human person, the human body. Likewise, you can generalize from that. If you understand that there is much more to us than we presently realize, you would be forced to the conclusion that there's much more that's vulnerable than we presently realize, because anything you don't know about, anything that belongs to the unknown, is something that necessarily you have no control over, and therefore, as you said, more things can go wrong. Look, for example, at how we understand genetics at the moment. For the last few decades, genetics have been understood to be, totally objective and material, and there are traits which are somehow encoded by these genes. They somehow result from the genes and so on. But recently, especially, there's been a lot of talk in the news about epigenetics, the way things can be passed down through what we consider to be the genes, but not really in the genes. I suspect the more we learn, the more we will understand that this ultimate substratum of the body's physicality is much more complex and has a lot more variables involved, especially over time and in terms of evolution, than we understand when we talk about quote unquote genes. Well, there again, you have the potential for things to go wrong. If it turns out that in all sorts of arcane ways, information is passed through the genes, as they're showing supposedly in certain studies today. And even if you look at the kind of more obscure paranormal accounts, you have stories about, I can think of one in particular, you have a young girl, who starts reliving all of these memories of being in World War II. Well, at first you would think, oh, maybe this is some sort of past life memory. Then it turns out that the memory she keeps reliving was something that her living grandfather experienced when he was in the war, and then never told anyone about. Well, there you have a case where we're not talking about a past life, but some sort of information that presumably is transmitted. Well, what if that were so, and what if, as a result, you've got this whole domain opened up of information and experience being passed down physically using some mechanism we don't even understand? Well, then look how concerned these otherworldly beings would be about contact with us, because they have a greater understanding of the stakes. The stakes are much higher for them in contact because they see much more about existence than we do. And not only in terms of lifespan, which you mentioned, which is a good point, but maybe about the indelible permanence of life and experience. Maybe this is why they only give people one chance again and again and again, because they understand on some other level that when something happens, it's written into history in some way that, we forget everything that happens all the time, and our histories are almost always completely false. For them, perhaps things remain burned into reality and existence, and that's why you only ever get one chance with them, either at a bar or when it comes to the Greys and their, sort of some of the mythology about the cosmic wars they engage in, where they, give a species one chance, and then they, if that species chooses badly, then they're locked in some sort of bitter struggle until the end of time. Well, maybe it's all of a piece in that regard.
Yeah, it's. I was thinking of this is Strieber's account of the blondes warning him that you could end up in a war with the Greys, and of fighting a war that you can neither win nor end. I've often thought that phrasing in relation to my divorce, but that's another story. But yeah, it's interesting, to try and shift the perspective around, to actually see where there'd be caution from their end, particularly on this level of the impact of experience upon them. Honestly, I'm not sure. I've never been quite able to understand why this sort of one chance. So, you've one opportunity with these beings. You can think of many examples of this. You can see, just today I was listening to a clip with Malachi Martin, Father Malachi Martin, who was a sort of a mainstay, I think, of the late night phone-in shows through the 90s. He's dead now, but this is a Catholic priest who would regularly speak of the secrets of Fatima. And as an aside, listening to him today, he did speak at one point in the late 90s or the early 90s about the third secret of Fatima. And the host put it to him. He said, "Well, now that you've the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, what role does Russia have?" And he said, "Well, look, I can't say. All I know is that what is to come is sort of is an echo of this Cold War, and it involves Moscow and Kiev." Well, that grabbed my attention. But just getting back to something Malachi Martin and these people were talking about. He was talking about the apparition at Fatima and the warnings given. And I did have the thought. I thought this seems to be extraordinarily harsh. There's a warning given in 1912. Certain people don't respond, but the humanity as a whole is then meant to suffer. Again, you can think of the overtures supposedly given to the American government in the 1950s. That there was a failure to respond in a certain way. This then means this, if you like, determines the course for the rest of humanity for at least up until the current day. I wonder, are we wrong to see people like Eisenhower and the decision makers in the 50s or the popes in the 60s as completely separate from us? And then are we wrong in a way, feel remorse for their decision or regret their decision when they are not in fact actually separate from us, but simply perfectly representative of that consciousness we do in fact have?
In answer to what you said, I would say that
sure,
I agree with you entirely that we're not separate. That's certainly the big takeaway of the key, the sort of holographic unity of all things. And where it says in the book that you're only as strong as the weakest among you, it's really a fake and arbitrary division to say that they are guilty, that they made a decision which is totally alien from us, especially when you consider that across time, there's the same holographic unity as what we would, more easily imagine being the case between things in space. I think time is really at the heart of the matter, at least in beginning to understand their severity and their kind of one chance mentality. The story that Strieber tells at some point in different forms about asking one of the graves what the universe means to him and getting in return the image of a closed coffin, that finality of existence, I think, is a function of the way time itself flows for us, them included. The fact that when something exists in the present, when it comes to exist in the present, that can never really be changed. When you think about the way time functions, when something happens, in its own way, it's now eternal. It's a part of an eternal past that cannot really be changed. You have the stories from the visitors who, in attempting to account for how they perceive time, something is said along the lines of, the future is fluid, whereas the past is ice, and the present is sort of the transition from the fluid to the ice. And in that regard, whenever something is done or thought or said, it's that way for all eternity. If they have some sort of keener sense of that, then that may inform their total relationship with us, relationship to themselves, so on and so forth. When a bad decision is made on account of the fact that it is now made for all time, they may, react accordingly in ways that seem incomprehensible.
Yeah, I mean, this is all a piece of any sort of discussion of people's, self-understanding and belief in their own ability to govern and change the direction of their lives. I mean, it's a standard fare within a lot of spiritual traditions. There's fundamentally people that don't change or incapable of change. There's certain patterns which are behaviors from the early 20s until the day they die. In this regard, certain moments with the visitors where this seems to be a great deal of finality may just be the moment where certain patterns are exposed. So we may look at this and think, oh gee, that's terribly harsh. From their point of view, it's from another point of view, it's perfectly just and logical response to the pattern which has declared itself. So to go back to the instance we initially started talking about, was this man in dealing with this, we'll just call her a girl for now. He thinks impure thoughts of some kind. it may seem in one way it's maybe a bit of a harsh, close down the possibility of a relationship in this instance on his response to what he heard. But the greater fact may be is that his tendency is towards such thinking, irregardless of what circumstances happen to bring it about in that instance. Her sense could be that other circumstances to give rise to that tendency for a particular way of thinking. I'm not sure if I can just digress a little here and just add some things. That when we're talking about various spiritual masters and spiritual people, you had the very interesting example of Adida Franklin Jones, who by many people's account was probably one of the most extraordinary spiritual figures of really the last since in living memory. Ken Wilber, for instance, whom we've spoken about before, for whatever his faults, he does have a definite familiarity with that, with that spiritual scene. And he said, several times he went on the record and went off the record too in describing Adida as the great avatar of the age. I mentioned this to sort of introduce what his take on astrology was, and I know of this because I did know the man who had acted as his astrologer. Now, what's interesting here was his account of how astrology could possibly work. He said it's nothing to do with planets exerting some sort of subtle, indetectable influence upon people's lives. You simply have correspondence between two discrete set of patterns. You have a pattern in our lives, and you have patterns in the planets around us. Now, to cut a long story short, is what he did. He was able to show, this person I knew said, is that if you look at the movements of what are known as outer planet transits, you will be able to come across, you will be able to spin out in people's lives. Now, this person I knew, he did actually say he did these readings for himself and for a lot of other people. They put him aside for a year and a half. Came back a year and a half, and lo and behold, a lot of these things came to pass. What is interesting is what was the sort of the ideas that underpinned this idea of astrology, this idea of patterns of attention, which sort of almost move mechanically, but do somehow, but leave us with this sense that we are actually independently and freely choosing amongst the various sort of circumstances. If that sort of idea that Darren brought was closer to reality than what we tend to conventionally think, then we definitely can see with the visitors that maybe there is this issue of sort of that they're giving us an opportunity to sort of display or display a sort of pattern of attention. And once we make a choice one way or the other, that tells you of that pattern of attention. That does for the rest of the relation.
What I would say in reaction to that is that these are two different ways of accounting for the one chance severity that in a way bleed together or blend together. On the one hand, you could say that when you make a decision or when you behave a certain way, it manifests a variety of tendencies, maybe invisible tendencies. So that's perfectly legitimate and reasonable. And you see it in everyday life all the time. If someone behaves aggressively in a certain situation for no good reason, you might easily conclude that the person has an aggressive tendency. On the other hand, you would think that these visitors with their greater knowledge and perceptiveness, certainly if they've been observing us for any length of time, they would already know about these tendencies and that they would not have to wait for some external display, some outward display, in order to become aware of those tendencies. The fact that they perform these object lessons or they theatrically stage this or that in order to teach us something suggests that they have some idea of what we know, what we don't know, and what we need to learn. They probably have a pretty developed sense of who we are and what our tendencies are. So in that regard, I would lean toward the more, the temporal or eternalist explanation, but they're really not separate, because when you do act at a particular moment in a particular way, certainly it manifests tendencies, and those tendencies are of a piece with the behavior. And naturally, you have to be given the opportunity to act. It's almost like you're being allowed free will. You're being allowed the possibility of choosing or behaving a different way, and probably in certain circumstances, people do choose to behave differently. They do surprise the quote-unquote visitors. We hear about this in certain stories where an abductee, for example, might, say to a visitor, "Oh, well, how can I help you?" And the visitor being absolutely taken aback at this human abductee offering to help in some way. So there is always the capacity for surprise and for novelty. And that may in and of itself be a reason for giving the opportunity to act or behave a certain way. But it's the finality that comes afterward, the idea that you cannot later on choose to behave differently, which is what's problematic for human beings when we're trying to understand it. Because we understand ourselves to be a set of competing tendencies. On the one hand, you might have a tendency to be generous or magnanimous. On the other hand, you might have a tendency to be selfish. And when you're presented with a certain situation, it might be 51% versus 49%, and maybe you behave selfishly. And then when they react with this final severity, you say, well, wait a second, if this had only been slightly different, my other tendency would have manifest. Well, they don't seem to care. You don't get a second chance. You don't get a slightly rosier scenario. So in trying to understand their severity, you have to account for that. The fact that there are simply no second chances. It's not as if you choose badly, so they react badly and, maybe disproportionately, but that later maybe you're given a second chance. It seems like there's simply never any second chances.
There is the possibility that they're offering the gift of remorse to people. It's right to assume that at least they have a working understanding of human psychology. It's probably right to assume they know more about us than we know about ourselves in many, many ways, as we've already discussed. But you think about this, you think of the impact of maybe this guy who calls in. For the rest of his life, he'll have this in his mind. These impure thoughts cost him something. And we can assume equally this is the case for many, many other people. So what then do they have in their life? Rather than some sort of relationship with something we can't quite describe, they do have the sense that they blew it, that there was something about themselves that just like uncorrected, unexamined, unconsidered, and that cost them something great. So if we in a way are just some sort of electromagnetic structure, which is temporarily housed in this physical body, from a certain perspective, by offering that gift of remorse, by introducing this sort of remorseful conscience, they can affect actually changes over a long range that we just simply don't see. You see, I do think about in the Gurdjieff work what a great intermediate objective is actually subject the being to what they call remorse of conscience, and that is through finally, you accumulate enough sort of self-knowledge that you actually see yourself for the egotistical wreck that you are. To cut a long story short, in an equal way, what they may be doing is sort of providing that similar impetus. The people are left with this sense forevermore of, there was something about me that wasn't just quite right, that just didn't cut it.
Well, it's a very interesting point, and I think it's probably true. And you can draw that into line with this sort of eternalistic conception, in as much as the person has the reaction for which they think they're not responsible. Nevertheless, they're held responsible. They're never given a second chance because what they have thought or done in as much as it now exists or has occurred, it has occurred and exists for all eternity. Likewise, this remorse which is engendered is also just as permanent. And in that regard, it certainly does change them. You know, when the girl is upset at the fact that she's thought of as being, what was the term he used? Like,
floozy.
Floozy.
Yeah.
You know, she could well be upset not only for conventional female reasons, but because she feels that she is marked for all eternity by that thought. She has now been regarded by someone as a floozy. And it's possible that she might have otherwise gone her entire life without that having occurred. And yet now it's occurred, and it's always already occurred. It's unchangeable. And her reaction to him, therefore, is just as symmetrical. You know, he had the one chance, he blew it. So that she is as much marked as him. And so doing, maybe by being conscious of the fact that they're both being marked by everything that happens, she necessarily has to have her severe reaction. And then he, in turn, is marked by the regret. And that may function as a kind of gift because it modifies and changes him later. So in that regard, you know, these instances may be many-sided.
Yeah, and it could be, there was something he said that in terms of, you know, you have to ask the question, why him? Why did he seemingly get singled out? He did say the one sort of critical or biographical fact he revealed was, he said he was very interested in ghosts. And this, in a way, this interest, I thought, in a way, this can be a reflection of some sort of latent psychic ability on his behalf. Which is to say that he is sort of an intimation that there is something to the reality. There is something in his reality which is paranormal. You know, he accepts it, you know, because he can sense it. He senses it and then intellectually accepts the possibility. So, you know, for him, in a way, he might not see. His thoughts and what he's thinking about other people may have be extraordinary, be influential in ways he simply can't surmise. If we're taking the idea that, you know, human consciousness tends to be more open than we accept, and if we were to, you know, think of it this way, rather than that they're closed systems, more like open-ended climatic systems, you know, at the edges they influence each other. So from a certain ethical perspective, the remorse he now has about his own thoughts may give rise to a very definite determination to manage those thoughts, which in turn will have knock-on effects all around him. But you know, I can't say. I'm just speculating here.
Well, I'm sure it's the case, and it's the case if only because of the fact that everything always has knock-on effects. I mean, anything you experience of any significance will affect and shape you, and then you in turn affect and shape things around you. So that's certainly the case. And in this instance, surely the net effect we might suppose is beneficial for the guy. On the one hand, he's sort of filled with a kind of regret that he doesn't, like a confusion and regret at the same time at something that was inexplicable and yet profound. And now he's sharing the story opens the eyes of many people and so on and so forth. So I think that's necessarily the case.
Yeah, it should also be noted that he did say he was very attracted to her. He did say he found her very attractive. So there's obviously going to be that kind of regret there. There's something that didn't come of whatever brief engagement he had with her.
It's worth bringing up again, to circle back around to the concept of mastery, because I find myself these days totally on the outside, more or less even in disagreement with everything that one can gather that is believed by these visitors and beings that are almost certainly superior. And that is, I no longer believe that there is any mastery. You know, in the days of my youth when I was much more together and so on, I think I possessed a certain mastery and that it was recognized by other people. But through a variety of events and so on, I no longer am able to possess any mastery, and I don't believe that it exists. I was on YouTube just last night, I think it was, and I had punched in Gurdjieff's name in order to look for some of the dances and the music to see if it had been filmed. And there are actually some color films of him. And you see the guy and you say, well, this is a man. That's some impression. There he is smoking a cigarette, you know. This is a man. Yeah. And then in the same searches, you find Krishnamurti, who is regarded by many also as a kind of unique spiritual sage. And he's reading and answering written questions from people. I don't know if it's from the audience or letters that were mailed to him. But somebody asked him a question about Gurdjieff. And the question was something like, you know, I have been a member of the Gurdjieff group for many years, and you know, do you think this causes fragmentation? And the guy standing there, and he repeats the question and he laughs. And it occurs to me, this guy's a joker. And to some extent, Gurdjieff is a joker. And then all these people who aspire to any kind of mastery, they're jokers. I mean, you can't say that conclusively without examining every single person who's ever been described as a master and saying so. But my wager is, my supposition, which, you know, anytime a human being has one of these, it's kind of like it's coming out of a place of conviction. And that is that everybody's a joker who is regarded as a master. Now, does that mean everything they say should be disregarded or that everything they say is false? Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the person himself, at the deepest level, is not what he purports to be. In other words, unless you are constantly advertising your own weakness and your own flaws, in a certain regard, you're fooling yourself and those around you. You know, because if there is any kind of aspect of your character which does not speak of mastery, which does not imply mastery, and yet you kind of shove it aside in order to develop this mastery side, well, you know, it's not mastery. To me, and it's been this way, I think, for years without me realizing it, I would rather indulge in flaws. I would rather publicly advertise my total lack of mastery to the point of outward ridiculousness and reside there than ever be in a position of so-called mastery. Now, to the extent that I believe that, I'm no longer in line with, you know, the visitors with their mastery or with the human spiritual achievement and its different accomplishments of mastery. So I'm kind of out on a limb, but yeah, I'd be interested in what you have to say to that.
Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that that idea is of sort of mastery, some sort of Ubermensch, superhuman development, is one that is sort of common in, I think, Western thinking nowadays. I can think of a couple of examples I know at hand. For example, with Gurdjieff, accounts of Gurdjieff written now tend to exaggerate his capacities. For instance, you will read about his remarkable capacity for making money or for reading people. You'll hear about his extraordinary felicity with languages, his ability with children, so on and so forth. Whereas people who were closer to him at the time were much more ready to could see his foibles more clearly, such as he was not in fact an exceptional linguist. We know this that John Bennett, who was an extraordinary linguist and a British Army intelligence officer, could report as much. He said Gurdjieff spoke 2-3 languages properly, 2-3 languages badly. Gurdjieff lost a lot of money. He got ripped off by people, you know, and so on and so forth. Gurdjieff left half a dozen illegitimate children in his wake. You see the same with Krishnamurti himself. Krishnamurti is that, you know, for supposed spiritual master, he quite a penchant for Italian handmade shoes. And he did keep a mistress, I believe, of the wife of a friend. So in very significant moral and interpersonal ways, these people are, far from masters. The idea receives much traction, or it maintains momentum from, guys like Ken Wilber. And, Ken Wilber is someone who, works hard to promote this idea of sort of all dimension mastery, or this development across all lines of development. So, for instance, in his recent in series of interviews he gave, he talks about his own spiritual formation, and he says he dealt with this teacher and that teacher, and he got this and he got that, and so on and so forth. All the while, he refuses to speak about Adi-Da, because it actually points to a very normal human failing, which is that he was fooled, he was naive, and so on and so forth. Now, once we dispense of this idea of this sort of, all-dimension mastery, we come back to this idea of lines of development. And we're talking about one particular line, which is this, line of spiritual development, which involves some capacity to discern greater truths. Someone like Gurdjieff or Krishnamurti or even Wilber definitely have this capacity. And the reason I say that is many people close to them could experience what's called transmission. Is that with this development, with the spiritual development, comes a radiation, for want of a better word, this constant radiation of particular energy that people experienced, and that in their company, yes, they felt that this was a master. Strangely, and for reasons I don't quite know, is this mastery can be developed within a personality which is quite repugnant in many, many ways. Another outstanding example is Adi-Da, who of all these spiritual figures who have made their way around the American landscape, at least since the Second World War. His manifestation was singularly powerful. And that's why people like Wilbur couldn't help themselves but write, this man is an avatar, this man is a Buddha. This is what he is. Now, can we assume the same thing is happening in non-human cultures? I suppose we can assume that. I think Strieber has pointed this a number of times. He gives the impression that some of these greys, they're full of personality, alongside this definite mastery. So it doesn't seem to resolve itself into some sort of bland, this bland goody two shoes aspect that you'd almost be given to expect.
Well, that's still what I reject. I don't reject the two-dimensional cartoonish caricature of mastery. For not being masterful enough, is therefore to be rejected. Although, to be contrary, I would still affirm that cartoonish view as more truthful in a sense than the more nuanced three-dimensional view. In other words, yes, if you can fly through the air, I will say that's mastery, fantastic. In fact, I would rather see two-dimensional feats. I would consider that more honest than the three-dimensional fuller view. It's precisely that I reject, and for the following reasons. Anyone who is able to manifest this sense of mastery and communicate it to others, as you mentioned, the people who were around some of these figures came away with a strong sense that these were masters. That's all well and good. I'm not conflating mastery with sainthood. I'm not saying that because a master is not a saint, therefore he's not a master. Sainthood has nothing to do with it, and certainly moral failings, in a sense, have nothing to do with it either. What I'm saying is that we are never identical with ourselves, and inasmuch as anyone undertakes to be a master, there's something hopelessly flawed about it. You certainly can cultivate the powers of mastery, and you might even do good with it. You might improve those around you. All of these things are true. But to me, that's just a cultivated ability. If you are a weightlifter, you will end up being able to lift heavy things that others cannot. If you cultivate this sort of inner mastery, as someone like a Gurdjieff, perhaps a Krishnamurti, and many others have done, you will no doubt then be able to manifest it and be a master of those around you. and they will sense it, and perhaps they will benefit. All these things are true, but I think it's unavoidable that when you engage in mastery, if you attempt to control, even if it's to instruct, if through higher consciousness you try to control or affect change in those around you, it's inevitable that to some extent you must think of yourself as a master. And I think this is the original sin of mastery. Certainly when it comes to human beings, I think this must be inevitable. You must at some point become conscious of your mastery. And at the moment you become conscious of your mastery, you've launched yourself into illusion. What do you do afterward? Well, you can work to suppress that knowledge or work to convince yourself of otherwise, but I don't think you ever fully succeed. Really as one way of approaching it, take the fundamental insight of psychoanalysis, which is that the better part of human beings is unconscious, and that what's unconscious is not simply things that are not known, but things that intrude or shape our experience of everyday life. That there are things that are known in the unconscious, thoughts that are thought, perspectives that are held in the unconscious that don't belong to the conscious mind, and if anything are rejected, and yet nevertheless try to appear. The idea there, if you want to use a visual metaphor, is that the ego is sort of the tip of the iceberg, whereas the better part and the more decisive part of it, obviously, is what's underneath the surface of the water. Well, I think that must necessarily hold true for any human being. At what point do you become a spiritual master? I mean, is it when you're 9 years old? Well, if so, then everything up to the point that you became a spiritual master must be, in some ordinary, conventional sense, human. There's a conscious mind, an unconscious mind, competing desires, hidden desires. What about if you become a master at age 21? And anyone who has been a human child and who emerges out of childhood at some point abandons the better part of themselves, and that part becomes asleep in a certain sense and shapes them. They are always more than who they are. So all of these efforts at mastery, I just don't see how, unless you can stop being a human being altogether, and maybe then end up being someone who can fly through the air and teleport, and there's nothing but a collection of two-dimensional, feats. I mean, to the extent you remain a human being, you cannot be a master. And so that's why now I sort of reject it all out of hand. It's not that I reject it on the grounds of moral failing or from the outside. It's from the inside that the flaw arises. It's the internal experience of the person who is the master that I think it can ultimately work.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you've said. I mean, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that the idea that you have some sort of discrete duality between mastery and non-mastery is maybe not particularly useful. I mean, it's probably better just to sit with the idea of sort of a scale of consciousness where you have, an evolution possible, along that scale. And there I'd sort of have to mention that idea of development given, whether it's psychological or spiritual development given by, it was Robert Kagan, where he said that where the subject of one level of development becomes the object of the subject of the next level of development. Whereas there's this ever gaining critical distance between the self and the experiences of the self, which is in line with the nature of spiritual development as discussed by someone like Gurdjieff or any other number of people, where it is not so much you're trying to acquire a power, acquire a mastery. What you're simply trying to do is to distance yourself or cease to identify with that which is arising within your awareness. In that context, the explanation given within the Eastern traditions for paranormal abilities is very different from what we find in the West, whether it's in your lunatic groups like Scientology, or even that sort of ideas coming out from the Stanford Research Institute. From these people, you have the idea that these are abilities to be developed. It's latent within you. You do these things, and these things will develop in time. In the Eastern tradition, their account of the city is these are things that occur incidentally. In the process of surrendering yourself, these will naturally happen. And what they would say is it's basically nothing to do with your awareness per se. They're just things that occur around your person that, in an equal sense, you should not identify with them. So I think what can happen is with people is that they're in their locality, the locality of their individual perspective. They see these things arising, but they understand that that is arising, but in a much greater context of, you know, a singular consciousness or universal consciousness or self with a capital S, or you know, Rigpa, or whatever it's called, whatever tradition. I'm not sure if that really is speaking to what you're saying, but
no, it certainly applies. I would differ, though. I mean, what you say on its own is certainly legitimate, although I would stop before reducing mastery to one of its aspects. In other words, you could take what we're referring to as mastery and say, well, if we treat mastery as instead being something like increased spiritual knowledge, then it's possible for people on different lines of development to, achieve different results. I think it's at least important provisionally to stick to what we mean when we say the word mastery. You know, if you think of mastery of a musical instrument, what does it mean? Someone who's a master of the violin. It's someone who is able to do anything he or she wants on the instrument. For example, you might measure that in terms of the repertoire. Well, that person is able to play 100% of the existing repertoire with 100% accuracy, fluency, musicality, and so on. Someone has mastered the instrument, someone's mastered the repertoire. Now, in terms of music, even that implies a certain mode of consciousness. You know, you cannot be a master of an instrument and remain totally unconscious of what you're doing, or have absolutely zero knowledge of either the pieces you're playing or the parts of the instrument and so on. So there's a relationship between mastery in the ordinary sense of something like a musical instrument and consciousness and knowledge. Now, when we talk about spiritual mastery, in as much as it describes what all of these different spiritual masters hope to attain or pretend to attain, then we're talking about something that you might call, to some extent, self-mastery. That is, they either aspire to be, pretend to be, or succeed at being 100% self-conscious. And through being self-conscious and being aware of their motives and so on and so forth, they acquire self-control, self-mastery. And in a lot of the material, I mean, I recently just finished the Uspensky book on Gurdjieff. And reading about the exercises and so on, it seems to me that if you're attempting to attain physical self-mastery with different exercises, then that has a certain meaning. And likewise, through self-knowledge and increased self-awareness, what you're really trying to achieve is a kind of self-mastery. The combination of willfulness and intention on the one hand, and what occurs in the next moment on the other hand. That's perfectly legitimate. There's no question by itself. But then the question is, does it ever succeed? Can you ever be so 100% self-transparent that there's basically no gap between your willfulness and your desire to be a certain thing and the thing that emerges? It seems to me that maybe to the extent that you're embedded in the time stream at all, that's impossible. To the extent that, I mean, if you have to try to be something, if you have to will it, if you have to intend it, it's not mastery in the fullest sense. And as consequence of that, I believe what you have is a variety of what you might call moral failings, although that's not the central issue for me. But you have something which never reaches the mark.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, in terms of the mastery someone like Gurdjieff would have had, the mastery is an ability to control the direction of attention to the extent that exists. Ultimately, his exercises were purposed towards retaining an objectivity in the awareness. So there's an intention turned within, there's an intention turned on its own source, whereas at the same time you retain an awareness of what's arising around you. Now, what they would say, what Gurdjieff and others would say, is that if you continue with this practice, you master this practice, your emotional, intellectual, and physical functioning will improve in and of itself. You will begin to display an emotional mastery without ever directly intending to do so. So, for instance, people have had the idea of being extremely Christian or extremely moral, love one another, so on and so forth. Something like the Gurdjieff work, or even something like Dzogchen within Tibetan Buddhism, is that they would never posit that as an actual open objective. They never say to you, well, okay, now what you need to do is repeat, I love everybody 10,000 times a day, and everyone you meet, do your best to love them. What they would simply do is they would try and introduce you to the true nature of your mind. They would try and have you cease to identify with that which is immediately arising. In doing so, naturally enough, they say that those patterns of attention which give rise to immoral behavior or unchristian behaviors, in and of themselves undo themselves. There's in the Hindu tradition, they speak of knots in consciousness. By simply paying attention to them or giving them a sort of a compassionate attention, those knots undo themselves. And so emotional mastery arises, intellectual mastery arises, control of the physical body arises. I'm with you in that I don't think it's not possible for many Western people to actually really arrive at any meaningful mastery in that sense. I think what often happens is we're bringing so many highly established patterns of behavior that they seldom shift significantly. This is something that's long been noted by many within the Gurdjieff work, is that there are a lot of people involved and very few are changing. The way I sort of explain that to myself is that people who are born into a Western culture, in the main, are fundamentally not interested in spiritual development. You tend to find that the great realizers are born into highly spiritual cultures, if you like, born in places like India or Tibet, into families which are oriented in that direction. The culture and education they receive is directed towards obvious spiritual goals, and they find their way very quickly. There's a couple, offhand. I think it was Nisargadatta. He said that for enlightenment to actually occur, you need to be born into highly spiritual parents. Everything needs to be right from the beginning. Otherwise, it's simply not going to happen. So in that regard, mastery in a Western context for people following these teachers is really, it just doesn't happen that often. Whereas it's sort of a full-blown mastery where people cease to identify with the full contents of the body mind, that does occur. I believe that does occur, but it tends not to occur in non-Western cultures and contexts.
Well, it's an interesting point, and of course it's an empirical question. It would have to be, you'd have to either see it or not to judge if it's so. But I'm reminded of something at the end of the Ouspensky book, where Gurdjieff is talking about a certain type of person, and the Russian term for it I can't possibly pronounce, but something like Obyatel.
Yeah.
Oh. Mm-hmm. And this not only meshes with my own personal experience, but it makes good sense of something that appears in the key, where supposedly the so-called master of the key claims that something like nearly half of all human beings have achieved radiance. And you think, well, how's that even possible? Well, if you abandon the sort of internal class notions and the way we relate to one another, and the categories and the boxes you necessarily put other people into for strategic reasons and for selfish reasons. If you look at simply, what's going on inside of them, what kind of light is coming out, you find that in many more cases, what's going on inside of a person is very other than what you'd expect, even in people with, quote unquote, moral failings, outward moral failings, or people who seem very simplistic or straightforward on the outside. Oftentimes, there's this great unseen depth where certainly all sorts of things are taking place that aren't immediately visible.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, you could tie all this together and say that the problem perhaps with mastery when it comes to human beings is that there's no mastery in human beings that is not collective. In other words, if you find that there are personal limitations in Gurdjieff, perhaps those limitations themselves would have been changed or eliminated or altered if those around them had been of a better quality. And the same thing goes for everybody. The amount of mastery we're able to achieve here and there is really a function or result of the amount of collective mastery we attain. And you can break that down into cultural differences. And you could certainly say, well, as a rule in the West, it's far less likely to appear because there are all these cultural discouragements that occur. Whereas in the East, for cultural reasons, because there are norms and traditions, it's able to appear more often. Nevertheless, it may be true, in a certain sense, what's said in the key, that everything that mankind involves itself in a sense, is a collective endeavor. We either all succeed or we all fail. And our own spiritual masters might have had more mastery of human beings collectively, were better.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you say. I mean, there are various people who've made sort of similar points. David Hawkins, for one, who's an American. He wrote a whole series of books in the 90s. A friend of mine, he's deeply impressed by what he says. But Hawkins makes this point. He says there's almost mathematical relationships which can be drawn that there are. The development of a handful of individuals is really outweighing the collective negativity of millions and millions. Just getting back to what you said about the Obi-Vattel, I mean, what Ouspensky was reporting from Gurdjieff is simply, in a way, quite a banal observation, is that the evolution of humanity, spiritual evolution of humanity is not, is widespread. It's not happening here and there in elite circles, people who find themselves lucky enough to find Ouspensky and Gurdjieff and the like. It really is across the board. Everyone is evolving in their way, or devolving as the case may be. What I think, the value in the Obi-Vattel, what Ouspensky and Gurdjieff were talking about was the importance of just leading a good life, simple life, which is a sort of, anyway, in a way, the equivalent of what he was a manager of Liverpool Football Club. He said, soccer is a very simple game. It's just 0-0 when you go out. Just make sure you don't make it worse. In a way, it's the same with a life. You start off, it's 0-0. Just don't screw it up. Don't make it a whole lot worse. And so that is value, in and of itself. In terms of the problem with evolution and the problem with enlightenment is that you simply, the way I see it is, you don't actually know what your karmic inheritance is. You don't simply know what it is you're dealing with. So you find that in the Eastern tradition, it's filled with people who simply hear something once. There's a pointing out instruction, and there's a vast level of enlightenment follows. Equally, you have people who practice for 30, 40, 50 years and seemingly get nowhere. For everybody, the rate of development and the pace of development is individual. It's idiosyncratic, and it's, I think for Western peoples, they just carry such a burden of a particular karmic burden, which makes spiritual evolution most difficult. I think it's interesting, you talk about Ouspensky, that Ouspensky at the end of his life completely rejected Gurdjieff's ideas. He completely rejected what he called the system. And I think that's very significant. I think there is,
probably great danger inherent in the idea of thinking that, you know, you can somehow start climbing some ladder to some evolutionary state. That in itself is very condemning. I think that really tends to trap you. In terms of what our actual response to things can be, I'm not sure if we can ever, you know, properly arrive at one. You know, think here of what Papaji said. You know, he was somebody many people said was enlightened, and he said something very interesting. He said, for reasons best known to itself, the self chooses people to be enlightened. Somehow just things happen. And so that in a way would, what I think, force a lot of Westerners to turn on their head. One of the core assumptions is that all outcomes within the sort of the domain of the psyche are controllable, or at least can be influenced.
Well, those are excellent points.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing. You've read Ouspensky, and I'm not sure what overall impression it had on you, but I read that about 10 or 12 years ago, and a life-changing impact on me. And alongside that, I have to thoroughly recommend, there's a biography of Ouspensky by Gary Lachman, and that in a way tells you an enormous amount about the spiritual process, what actually happened to Ouspensky, particularly towards the end of his life, where he had to he basically surrendered the confidence he had in Gurdjieff's teaching. Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, as you probably know, they fell out. And, you know, they went 20, 30 years and they didn't speak to each other. Why they fell out is a bit of a mystery, but it has a lot to do with, there's an academic in Switzerland, Paul Beekman Taylor, who, as a child, was very much in around Gurdjieff and his milieu. And from him, you have a very human portrait of Gurdjieff emerges, particularly regarding his many sexual dalliances, leaving illegitimate children here or there. And I think to Ouspensky, he was extraordinarily proper, if proper is the right word, but also a very moral man in his way, in a very conventional sense. I think he was just deeply offended by that around Gurdjieff, particularly his sexual behaviors. So for Ouspensky, he would later be quite clear that Gurdjieff had a teaching, but it was a teaching he himself had not really greatly absorbed. It's something, you know, I've given a lot of attention to and consideration to, is because ultimately I found with the Gurdjieff work, it just fundamentally, it doesn't work. You know, there's this drive for mastery that's held out by the Gurdjieff work. I mean, it can give rise to definite interesting experiences, but fundamentally the experience of your own consciousness, in a way, it remains. You don't fundamentally change that much. And this is something I saw, you know, I saw in a lot of other people. I mean, there are changes occur, but, you know, I'm not sure how much that had to do with the work itself, or is that simply just age and natural maturity imposing itself on your life?
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I'm sure your observation is correct. It's why I've always been suspicious of the spiritual groups, if you want to call it that. I call them that because it seems so much of it. I mean, if you put a child in front of a group, not as a member, but simply to observe what would the child see, and what you would see is a lot of people who are trying really hard to believe, and even when they manage to behave different ways than they're accustomed to, and all of it is just so much willfulness and desire for things to be so, that after a certain point, when that desire leaves, everything collapses. It's a kind of shell of what it was. It wouldn't surprise me if that happened to Ouspensky to some extent. You know, after you pursue a teaching or a path for so many years or decades, in the end, what you're left with, probably two things, I would think, although it's speculation in his case. First is an awareness that all it ever was your desire, I'm not talking in the sense of make-believe, but in the end, all you have left is the fact that you desired to take the path. Wherever you end up, you're at the end of a certain path. You're no longer on the path, and all you realize that there was a kind of movement, a desire to move down it. But secondly, I suspect in the case of somebody like Ouspensky, when you pass through or outgrow a teaching, that's commensurate with a developing awareness that what you're dealing with is simply the fact of the other person. In each of these spiritual masters, I would imagine that the more time you spend with them absorbing their teaching, the less you become aware that there's a teaching in any objective sense, and the more that you become sort of, viscerally aware that all of this simply results from the fact of the other person. If Gurdjieff weren't the way he was, or, his teaching in some ultimate sense is simply a byproduct or a function of who he is as a person. Yeah. Certainly if you spend 20 years eating alongside, breathing, smoking with, talking, walking next to, the growing awareness that this other person is simply another person and not a transcendental teaching has to crowd in on your awareness and shrink your ability to believe simply in the fact of the teaching alone.
Yeah, as you say that, I think of, I know an Australian, he's a lot older than me, he worked with groups here in Sydney and in New York, and his observation was acute. He said that there is, amongst the second generation of pupils, in other words, the pupils of pupils, there is, he would be point blank adamant, there's simply no development. Instead, rather, you have a vast amount of delusion and all the politics you'd expect at such what is now a religious institution. But he said amongst the pupils themselves of Gurdjieff, he said there were many of them were quite extraordinary in their way. And in his explanation was, he said, in a way, the formal intellectual teaching is near irrelevant. There was something that Gurdjieff himself was able to basically, you're back to this idea of transmission. There was something about him that was able to affect a certain change in people. That they themselves had acquired is a certain something. There was I think in one of our earlier emails you'd asked about my own experience, and when I was involved, something that really plagued me was I'm making these huge efforts, and the people around me are making these huge efforts, but is anyone actually getting anywhere? And in all my research, I came across an essay which hooked my attention, and it was something that really obsessed me. And it was a basic biography of an obscure student of Gurdjieff, obscure in that he didn't write any books, he had no profile whatsoever. And this man's name was Paul Anderson. Paul Anderson had served as his American secretary. Anderson had then taught quietly in the 70s. He himself was in his 70s at the time. Someone had found him and asked him to run a group, and he did so in Massachusetts up until his death. What's interesting about Anderson, it's in all my accounts, or in all my studying around of Gurdjieff and his work, he's the only person who seemed to have come anything near the level, for want of a better word, of Gurdjieff himself. Anderson had exhibited many cities. And there was an essay written by a man called Russell Huff, where Huff describes these cities and these abilities Anderson had very clearly. I got in touch with Huff. I sort of just asked him about this, and he said, there was a lot more I could have included. Anderson was simply extraordinary. What was most interesting about Anderson is what he did towards the end of his life with the group he had. He was in Conway, Massachusetts, which my map tells me is very close to New York City. He had a group of students. Towards the end of his life, when he had a stroke and he knew he didn't have long left, rather than fold his group into the New York Foundation or one of the other American groups, he instead basically had his students join the Dzogchen teaching under Namkhai Norbu. I asked Huff about this. This seems extraordinary, what he did. And what Huff basically related to me, he said, is that Norbu himself had this quality that Gurdjieff had. And he really, in what Huff said and what Anderson had repeated, he says, the teaching in and of itself is really secondary to this sort of self-realization that can occur within, whatever, dogmatic form. So I've never met Norbu, but he is alive. And Russell Huff's advice to me, he said, if you want to get anywhere with this, you need to meet someone like Norbu. You need to actually receive this transmission, which is, of course, the classical advice within Guru Yoga. So without a guru, nothing's going to happen.
It's what has always made me profoundly skeptical about people who are dogmatists about meditation and spiritual practices and so on. So when it comes to transmission, I agree entirely with what you're saying. You have these people who appear and they kind of, I don't know, the signal to noise, they influence, their effect bleeds off, their influence bleeds off around them, but it doesn't last more than a generation or two. Not only when it comes to spiritual practice, but in terms of everything. I mean, it was psychoanalysis when it was new. Freud, was the originator and had all of these insights. And then the insights were imitated, but the originality certainly lessened. And then the generation after that, it was done. And you see it again and again in all aspects of human endeavor. You see it even in reproduction. You have fairly ordinary or even stupid parents giving birth to a brilliant child who then gives birth to very ordinary, stupid children. The transmission is always very local.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that is very, something I've given a lot of thought to lately. And, a couple of things. I mean, you talk about, the impact of Gurdjieff. I could tell you about some of the dogmatic responses you'd find within the work itself. And I should add, too, is that I was engaged with other teachings before I entered the Gurdjieff work. And even while I was in there, I remained engaged with them. As such, I always thought I had a bit of a broader perspective and didn't take any of this dogma on its face. As for Gurdjieff's influence, well, I'll tell you this story. There was an American, he recently wrote, he said he was in a group meeting in New York. Now, the New York Foundation is definitely one of the beating hearts of the institutional work. And it was said to him, he said, you're one of the youngest people in the room. What do you think? And he looked around and he had to acknowledge, he had to think, no, he was in fact the youngest person in the room. And he said, that's a shame because I'm in my mid-50s. And that sort of sums up where they're at. It's just, that's, to be brutal, it's a decaying and dying, spiritual expression. The other part in terms of, you talk about the role of practice and realization. I mentioned earlier on this woman I know of phenomenal psychic capacity, absolutely extraordinary psychic capacity. I've asked her about this. How did she develop this? How did this even come about? And at her hands, for what it's worth, I had the most profound experience of my life, full stop. I asked her about this. I said, how did this even come about? And she said to me, I was born that way. That was just it. She didn't do anything. That's just who she is. And I think what the truth of it is for a lot of people is that, basically, they're just like that. They're just naturals. And it's a genetic gift. The other thing I would say is this. My own perspective about my own spiritual endeavors may be very limited, as is yours. And we may be looking at this from the wrong perspective. It is possible that these teachings are not for now, but they're for a point maybe 50, 100 years from now, when we actually begin to control our genetic makeup and we actually secure for ourselves the longevity that many other humans apparently take as given in the universe. Which is to say that we may soon be able to live lives where we actually have the amount of time needed to generate these results. That's the conclusion I'm coming to. I think something like the Gurdjieff work or whatever practice can work if you have enough time. What happens for us is we just simply don't have the time and energy to do it. And even if you look at, just going back to that book you've read about Ouspensky, you've something that sort of indicates this. Ouspensky all the time wants results. He says, I want results. Gurdjieff promises him. He says, you will have results. So they go to Essentuki, and they go through a phase of the ramp-up efforts, this constant hammering away for weeks, and then finally something happens. This may point to the fact that there is a certain buildup of energies is needed. Gurdjieff was able to contrive certain circumstances where they could accumulate those energies to generate that result. For the rest of us, or maybe more typically, is we simply cannot. We're never going to have those circumstances, and even if we do, they're not potent enough to generate that result. What we may actually need is just more and more time, and we run out of time, given the fact we only reach 70 or 80. So that's sort of, I'm speaking to somebody who, right now, I mean, like I enjoy this conversation and I enjoy these topics, but typically it's not what I think about. Like I'm standing right here in front of my fridge, and I have a scheduled meditation done up. And again, I've been down this track before where I ramp up efforts, I sustain them for a long time. Some changes seem to be emerging, but then fundamentally, to cut a long story short, nothing happens. And you do have to step back from the process and just wondering what it is about it that keeps forcing me to double down. And I just wonder of myself, what is it that I'm, am I singularly wrong-headed in what I'm doing? Am I wasting my time? Why am I doing this? So, you make reference to, other psychological factors which are not typically considered, but, I'd have to sympathize with any sort of skeptical view of the whole process.